The story of the Martelli crime family begins not with a gunshot, not with a deal in a darkened alley, but with hunger, rubble, and silence. Naples, 1946. A city still scarred by the war, its streets littered with broken stones, its people carrying shadows far heavier than the ruins above them. The war had ended, but peace had not arrived. The black market was the only market, and survival was the only law. Among the thousands of boys who wandered those shattered streets, one stood out, not because he was stronger, nor taller, but because of his eyes. Dark, steady, unflinching. His name was Antonio Martelli, the son of a dockworker who had returned from the war with nothing but scars and a broken back. His mother washed clothes for neighbors, her hands cracked and red from soap and cold water. Antonio grew up fast, not because he wanted to, but because childhood had no place in Naples. He learned early that the world belonged to those who could command respect, or instill fear. At 13, he was already running errands for smugglers at the port, carrying sacks of contraband cigarettes hidden beneath crates of fish. At 15, he saw his first man killed in a quarrel over ration cards. The image didn't haunt him. Instead, it clarified something deep inside. In this city, power was not inherited, it was taken. But Antonio wasn't reckless. He had a gift, rare among the desperate: patience. While others lunged at every opportunity, Antonio observed, waited, and struck only when the odds bent in his favor. He understood people, their weaknesses, their desires, their fears. By the time he was 20, whispers had already begun. "Martelli, that boy has the eyes of a man twice his age." The first step into darkness. Antonio's true entry into the world of crime came through contraband tobacco, the bloodline of Naples in the post-war years. American sailors smuggled crates of Lucky Strikes and Chesterfields into the port, and men like Antonio carried them into the alleys, where they sold for fortunes. The police knew, but they also smoked. What mattered was who controlled the flow, and Antonio wanted control. At first, he worked under Don Gennaro Russo, a minor boss who ran smuggling routes through Mergellina. But Antonio quickly realized Russo lacked vision. Russo loved quick money, flashy suits, loud laughter in crowded taverns. Antonio, by contrast, saved his profits, invested in people. He paid for a neighbor's doctor when her son was sick. He bought bread for widows. He lent money with no interest to desperate fathers. The people began to whisper again, "Martelli takes care of his own." This was Antonio's genius. He understood that fear alone could control men for a season, but loyalty could bind them for a lifetime. He was not building a gang. He was planting the seeds of a dynasty. One night, in the damp backroom of a bakery, Antonio made his first real move. He confronted Russo, not with violence, but with certainty. "Don Gennaro," he said, "your men respect you, but they don't love you. One day, when trouble comes, they will vanish. With me, they know I will never vanish. Choose. Stand with me or be forgotten." Within weeks, Russo had disappeared into obscurity, his men wearing Martelli's loyalty like a new skin. Antonio was only 23, but already people called him Il Giovanni Re, the young king. The code of silence. Power requires structure. Antonio knew this instinctively. He had seen men rise and fall because they confused greed for leadership. So he created his code of silence and loyalty, rules that would define the Martelli family for generations. Loyalty above all. Betrayal is punished with silence. A man simply disappears. Respect to the people. The family protects its neighborhood, offers work, ensures food on tables. Violence only when necessary. A knife can win a fight. Silence can win a city. Never show weakness. In Naples, weakness is blood in the water. The code spread quietly, whispered from mouth to ear, until it was no longer just rules but a creed. And men began to gather. Dockworkers, smugglers, even former soldiers. They were drawn not just to Antonio's cunning but to his vision. A world where the Martelli name would mean security, order, and fear. By the 1950s, Antonio controlled entire stretches of the port. Cigarettes, silk, sugar, even stolen radios, everything passed through his hands. He paid the police just enough to keep them looking elsewhere, but not so much that they became greedy. He fed children when fathers couldn't. He repaired churches when the state ignored them. To the people, he was both saint and devil. The first betrayal. No empire grows without blood. For Antonio, the first true test came from within. Among his closest men was Salvatore Romano, a childhood friend. They had grown up together, stolen bread together, bled together. Salvatore was fiery, reckless, always eager for violence. While Antonio built loyalty, Salvatore built fear. But ambition is a poison. When whispers reached Antonio that Salvatore had been making secret deals with rival smugglers in Posillipo, Antonio refused to believe it. Loyalty was sacred. Salvatore would never betray him. Or so he thought. One cold evening, as the waves crashed against the port, Antonio followed the whispers. He found Salvatore in a warehouse, shaking hands with the very men Antonio had sworn to drive out. The betrayal was real. The next night, Antonio gathered his men in silence. Salvatore was brought before them, his eyes wide, searching for mercy. "Antonio," he pleaded, "I did it for us, for the family. We could have doubled our profits." Antonio said nothing at first. Then, in a voice colder than the sea, he replied, "Profits feed the stomach. Loyalty feeds the soul. Without loyalty, we are nothing." Salvatore's body was never found. His name was never spoken again. The silence was louder than 100 gunshots. And everyone understood. Antonio Martelli was not a man you betrayed. The making of a king. By the 1960s, Antonio Martelli had risen from a hungry dockworker's son to a ruler in all but name. His family, no longer just blood but bound by loyalty, stretched across Naples. Politicians came to him for votes. Priests came to him for donations. Businessmen came to him for protection. But Antonio was no fool. He knew power was never permanent. Rivals circled like wolves. The Ricci family from the east, the Ferrone brothers from the north, Sicilian bosses who looked at Naples as ripe for conquest. So Antonio began grooming his son, Marco Martelli, a boy with his father's dark eyes but a sharper hunger. Marco grew up not in the rubble of war, but in the marble halls his father's money had built. He studied business in Rome, politics in Milan, but his true education came from sitting quietly beside his father at the dinner table, watching deals made with a nod, wars prevented with a glance. Antonio knew his dynasty was secure. Or so he thought. Shadows over Naples. By the late 1950s, Naples was a city of contradictions. Tourists wandered the narrow streets, marveling at the music, the laughter, the smell of fried dough drifting from alleyways. But beneath the surface, another Naples pulsed, a darker one, where every handshake carried hidden meaning, where every glance could be a threat. Antonio Martelli stood at the crossroads of those two worlds. To his neighbors, he was a benefactor, the man who ensured their children had food when the factories closed. To rivals, he was a storm cloaked in calm, the figure who controlled the docks with an iron grip. His empire wasn't just about money. It was about something greater: respect, permanence, the idea that the Martelli name would outlive poverty itself. But Antonio understood something few others did. Power was fragile. It lived not in the streets, but in the hearts of people. If they believed in him, he would endure. If they doubted, his world would crumble. So he walked a delicate line, balancing fear with loyalty, violence with mercy. The expansion. Antonio's rise from smuggler to ruler of the docks had been swift, but expansion beyond Naples required more than muscle. It required alliances. He began reaching out to Sicilian families, men whose names carried weight across Italy. The Grecos, the Inzerillos, the Corleonesi. Meetings were held not in smoky bars but in the back rooms of elegant cafes, hidden behind lace curtains and cups of espresso. Antonio's charisma impressed them. Unlike many Neapolitan bosses, he spoke of long-term vision, of order and discipline. He proposed routes that connected Sicily's heroin shipments with Naples ports and onward to France, Germany, even America. The Sicilians saw in Antonio a man who could be trusted, not because he was soft, but because he was consistent. A deal with Martelli was a deal that would be honored. That reputation was worth more than bullets. By 1962, Antonio's family wasn't just smuggling cigarettes. They were moving cargo worth millions across Europe. And yet, Antonio kept his roots close. He never left Naples, never abandoned the alleys that had raised him. He wanted his people to see that he was still one of them, even as his suits became finer and his home transformed into a villa with marble floors. Family above all. Antonio's wife, Elena, had been with him since his earliest days. Where Antonio was steel, Elena was fire. She kept the household together, raised their 3 children, and demanded that despite the blood on Antonio's hands, his family would never drown in that darkness. Their eldest, Marco, was Antonio's heir apparent. Sharp-minded, disciplined, and ambitious, Marco absorbed his father's lessons with quiet intensity. He sat at the edge of meetings, learning how to measure men not by their words but by their silences. The second son, Vittorio, was different, gentle, artistic, drawn more to books and music than to power. Antonio loved him fiercely but knew he was not made for the life of the streets. Their youngest, a daughter named Isabella, was the jewel of the Martelli household. Protected fiercely by her brothers, adored by her father, she represented something pure in a world of shadows. For Antonio, his children were not just blood. They were legacy. Everything he built was for them, so that the Martelli name would echo through history not as beggars or laborers, but as rulers. The First War. Inevitably, peace shattered. By 1965, Antonio's rise had drawn the attention and jealousy of the Ricci family, longtime rulers of eastern Naples. Don Carlo Ricci was an old-school gangster, violent, brash, a man who believed respect was earned only through bloodshed. The conflict began with whispers, a shipment of tobacco intercepted, a man beaten in an alley, a threat scrawled on a wall. Then came the gunfire. One evening, as Antonio left a cafe in Mergellina, bullets tore through the air. 2 of his men fell dead. Antonio barely escaped. The message was clear. The Riccis wanted war. Antonio responded not with rage, but with calculation. He gathered his lieutenants in a candlelit room. If we fight like animals, we lose everything. We will not give them chaos. We will give them silence. And silence came. Within weeks, Ricci's warehouses burned in the night. His allies were found vanished, swallowed by the sea. No public gunfights, no reckless blood. Just a steady, relentless erosion of his power. Finally, Don Carlo himself disappeared after leaving a late-night meeting. His car was found near the cliffs, empty. His body was never recovered. The Ricci family crumbled. Naples belonged to Martelli. The legend grows. By the late 1960s, Antonio Martelli had become more than a man. He was a legend. His name carried weight not just in Naples, but in Rome, Palermo, even New York. Politicians whispered his name with caution. Priests, when accepting his donations, crossed themselves twice. And yet, Antonio never sought the spotlight. He understood that true power thrived in the shadows. While other bosses flaunted wealth with golden watches and fast cars, Antonio walked the streets in tailored but modest suits, shaking hands, blessing children, ensuring that the people never forgot he was one of them. His men called him Il Re Silenzioso, the Silent King. But as the 1970s loomed, Antonio knew his reign was nearing its twilight. Age was creeping in, his body heavier, his steps slower. He had built an empire out of rubble, but the question that haunted him was simple. Would it survive him? The passing of the torch. The answer lay in Marco. Marco Martelli was no longer the quiet boy at his father's side. By 1972, at 26 years old, he was already negotiating deals with businessmen, smoothing relationships with politicians, and overseeing smuggling operations that spanned half of Europe. But Marco was not his father. Where Antonio favored patience, Marco favored speed. Where Antonio valued loyalty, Marco valued fear. Antonio watched his son with a mixture of pride and dread. He knew Marco had the intelligence and ambition to surpass him, but he also feared that Marco's hunger would burn too hot, too fast. On a warm evening in the spring of 1973, Antonio gathered his family in their villa. His health was failing, though he did not speak of it. He looked at Marco, his dark eyes heavy with both love and warning. "You will inherit this world," Antonio said softly, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "But remember, Marco, it is not guns that hold power. It is silence. It is patience. Never forget the code." Marco nodded, but in his heart, the words already felt like chains. The end of the beginning. In 1974, Antonio Martelli died quietly in his sleep. Naples mourned. Thousands came to his funeral, not just gangsters and politicians, but ordinary men and women who owed him food, work, or protection. Bells tolled across the city. For one day, silence reigned, as if the streets themselves were paying tribute. But beneath the mourning, another truth simmered. A new era had begun. Marco Martelli, the son of the Silent King, was ready to seize the throne. And unlike his father, Marco would not wait in the shadows. He would set the streets of Naples on fire. Blood and silence. The rise of the Martelli crime family. Chapter 2: Blood on the Streets. A new king rises. When Antonio Martelli was laid to rest in the spring of 1974, the city of Naples trembled in silence. Shopkeepers closed their shutters, women dressed in black filled the churches, and even the hardest men of the underworld lowered their eyes. The Silent King was gone, and the question on every tongue was the same. What kind of ruler will his son be? Marco Martelli did not wait for the dust to settle. Just weeks after his father's funeral, he gathered the lieutenants of the family in the villa's grand hall. Where Antonio had been calm and deliberate, Marco was fire in human form. His voice carried not the patience of decades, but the urgency of youth. "No more waiting. No more silence," he declared, his fist striking the oak table. "My father built this empire brick by brick. I will expand it with fire and steel. Naples will no longer whisper the Martelli name. They will shout it." Some of the older capo regimes exchanged uneasy glances. They respected Marco, but they remembered Antonio's warnings. Too much heat, and the empire would collapse under its own flames. Yet none dared speak against him. The blood of the Silent King flowed in his veins, and the throne was his by right. The business of blood. The 1970s brought change across Italy. Heroin flooded Europe, replacing the old cigarette and coffee smuggling routes. Marco seized this opportunity with ruthless efficiency. Through contacts in Marseille, Istanbul, and Palermo, the Martelli family became a key player in the so-called French Connection. Money poured in, staggering amounts that dwarfed anything Antonio had ever imagined. With wealth came weapons, and with weapons came war. But heroin also brought chaos. Addicts multiplied in Naples' poorest neighborhoods, and with them came desperate thefts, overdoses, and police attention. For the first time, ordinary citizens began to see the Martellis not as protectors, but as predators. Marco didn't care. To him, fear was just another form of respect. Rivals in the shadows. Success, however, breeds enemies. While Marco was busy expanding, other clans plotted. The Santoro family, small but vicious, saw an opportunity to challenge Martelli control of the eastern ports. Street fights broke out. Cars were bombed. For the first time since the Ricci War, Naples shook with open violence. One night in 1977, Marco's convoy was ambushed on the road to Salerno. Bullets riddled the cars, shattering glass, tearing through steel. Marco's driver was killed instantly, but Marco himself crawled out of the wreckage, bloodied but alive. The message was clear. The streets were no longer his alone. Politics and betrayals. Unlike his father, Marco did not trust politicians. He bought them. With cash and threats, he placed Martelli loyalists in City Hall, in the police, even in the courts. Judges looked the other way. Police chiefs received envelopes stuffed with lire. Mayors attended Martelli weddings with smiles and handshakes. But politics is a double-edged sword. The more Marco leaned on the state, the more the state became entangled with him. And when allies grew too greedy, betrayal followed. In 1980, a shipment of heroin vanished before reaching the port. Investigations revealed it had been seized by customs officers tipped off by a politician Marco himself had bribed. Rage consumed him. The man who thought he could outsmart a Martelli was found days later, hanging from a bridge, his hands tied with red silk, the Martelli signature. The earthquake. That same year, fate itself tested Naples. In November 1980, a devastating earthquake struck Campania, killing thousands and leveling entire towns. Amid the rubble, government aid poured in. Money, contracts, reconstruction projects worth billions. Marco saw opportunity where others saw tragedy. The Martelli family infiltrated construction companies, rigged contracts, stole supplies. Entire neighborhoods were rebuilt with Martelli cement, Martelli steel, Martelli labor. What had been a natural disaster became the foundation of a criminal fortune. But with fortune came exposure. Journalists whispered of Mafia involvement. Investigators circled. The Martelli name was no longer just feared in the streets, it was printed in newspapers, broadcast on television. The empire had grown too large to remain in the shadows. The first fractures. By the mid-1980s, Marco's rule seemed absolute, but within the family, cracks began to appear. His younger brother Vittorio, the gentle soul Antonio had once shielded from the streets, returned from university in Rome. He pleaded with Marco to diversify into legitimate business, to shed the blood-stained empire for something lasting. "Father built something to protect us," Vittorio said. "You are turning it into a curse. Every brick is soaked in heroin and blood. Is this the legacy you want?" Marco's eyes burned with fury. "Legacy means power, Vittorio. Without it, we are nothing. You live in books and dreams. I live in reality." The argument split the family. Some capos quietly sided with Vittorio, seeing in him the wisdom of Antonio. Others tightened their loyalty to Marco, drawn by his ruthless energy. It was the beginning of a fracture that would one day shatter the Martellis from within. Blood on the streets. The Second Mafia War erupted in 1984. The Santoros, backed by Sicilian allies, declared open war on the Martellis. Naples became a battlefield. Drive-by shootings, car bombs, executions in crowded cafes. Blood stained the cobblestones daily. The city lived in terror. Mothers pulled children inside at dusk. Shopkeepers paid protection twice, unsure which clan would kill them if they chose wrong. The newspapers called it La Notte di Sang, the night of blood, that lasted not one night, but years. Marco thrived in the chaos. He moved like a general, orchestrating strikes with precision. But every victory left deeper scars. Friends died. Allies vanished. His sister Isabella, once shielded from the darkness, was nearly kidnapped by rivals as leverage. Marco rescued her, but the innocence of her youth was lost. By 1987, the Martellis emerged victorious. The Santoro family was annihilated, its leaders buried in unmarked graves. But victory came at a cost. Hundreds dead, the city scarred, and Marco himself hardened into something colder than even his father had feared. The shadow of the father. One night, Marco returned to the family villa, exhausted from war. He walked alone into his father's old study, the air still heavy with Antonio's presence. Dust covered the desk where the silent king had once written notes, drawn maps, counseled patience. Marco poured himself a glass of wine and stared at the portrait of Antonio that hung on the wall. For the first time in years, doubt gnawed at him. "Was I wrong?" he whispered to the silence. "Or did you not see the world changing?" The shadows offered no answer. End of chapter 2. By the close of the 1980s, Marco Martelli stood as the undisputed ruler of Naples. His wealth rivaled that of corporations. His influence reached Rome, Palermo, even New York. But inside his empire, cracks widened, fractures of family, of loyalty, of morality. The blood on the streets had bought him power, but also isolation. The silent king's son had become something his father never was. A monarch of fire, ruling not with patience, but with fear. And fear, like fire, consumes everything it touches. Blood and silence. The rise of the Martelli crime family. Chapter 3. The fall of the House of Martelli. Whispers of betrayal. The 1990s brought winds of change to Italy. The state, long timid in its fight against organized crime, finally struck back with force. Judges like Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino declared open war on the Mafia, dismantling networks that had stood for generations. Naples was no exception. The Martelli Empire, once thought untouchable, became the prime target of prosecutors and police. Surveillance units tapped phones, undercover agents infiltrated businesses, and witnesses, once too terrified to speak, began to whisper. Inside the family, paranoia spread. Marco suspected betrayal at every corner. Meetings grew tense, meals at the villa silent. The Martellis had always thrived on loyalty, but now loyalty itself became fragile currency. The brothers' rebellion. At the heart of the storm was Marco's brother, Vittorio. Unlike his brother, Vittorio had never been intoxicated by power. He invested secretly in hotels, restaurants, and shipping companies, businesses that could survive without blood. In 1991, Vittorio confronted Marco once more. "Look around you," he said in the dim light of the study. "The police close in. Our allies vanish. Even our soldiers grow tired. Father's legacy is ashes. Leave it behind, Marco. Let me lead us into legitimacy." Marco slammed his fist on the desk. "Legitimacy is weakness. Power is all that protects us. Do you think the state will spare us if we crawl to them as businessmen? They will destroy us regardless. Better to die feared than live forgotten." That night, a rift opened that would never heal. Vittorio began planning in secret, seeking a way to preserve at least part of the family from the inevitable fall. The Pentito. In 1992, disaster struck. One of Marco's oldest lieutenants, Salvatore Turri Romano, was arrested in Palermo. Facing decades in prison, Turri made the unthinkable choice. He became a Pentito, a collaborator with justice. His testimony was devastating. He revealed smuggling routes, hidden bank accounts, even the names of politicians who had dined at the Martelli Villa. For the first time, the state had a map of the empire. Marco raged like a wounded lion. "I raised him. I fed him. And he spits on my name." But no bullet could silence Turri now. He was under constant guard, his words recorded in courtrooms, his betrayal broadcast across Italy. The siege of Naples. The trials that followed became legend. Prosecutors called them Il Processo Martelli, the Martelli trial. Dozens of family members, soldiers, and corrupt officials were dragged into the light. On the streets, police raids smashed through doors at dawn. Warehouses burned, bank accounts were frozen, allies fled overseas. For the first time in half a century, the Martelli family was on the defensive. Marco struck back with violence. Judges were threatened, journalists beaten, witnesses silenced. But each act of brutality only fueled the state's resolve. Italy had buried Falcone and Borsellino in 1992, murdered by the Sicilian Mafia, and their blood became fuel for a nationwide crusade. Naples, once a city ruled by fear of the Martellis, now watched them with something new, hope for their downfall. The family fractures. Inside the villa, betrayal blossomed like rot in the walls. Capo regimes whispered of surrender. Soldiers deserted. Even Isabella, Marco's beloved sister, begged him to stop. "Marco," she pleaded, tears streaking her face. "You are killing us all. Father wanted peace. Vittorio is right. Let him take what is left. End this." But Marco could not surrender. Power had consumed him too deeply. To lay it down would mean admitting his father's lessons had been wasted, his own life meaningless. In 1994, Vittorio made his move. Secretly negotiating with prosecutors, he offered cooperation. Not names, not betrayals, but financial maps, documents, accounts that could cripple the empire. In exchange, he secured immunity for himself and Isabella, and protection for their investments abroad. When Marco discovered the betrayal, his roar shook the villa. But by then, it was too late. The state had everything it needed. The fall. On a cold morning in January 1995, police stormed the Martelli Villa. Helicopters thundered overhead. Armored cars blocked the gates. Marco, standing on the balcony in his silk shirt, watched as his empire collapsed in fire and steel. He considered fighting. He considered dying like a king, gun in hand. But as he looked around, empty halls, silent rooms, the ghosts of his father and fallen brothers, he realized the war was already lost. Marco Martelli surrendered without a word. The trial of the century. The trial that followed captivated Italy. Marco sat in the defendant's cage, his once fiery eyes dulled by years of war and betrayal. Witness after witness testified. Politicians, bankers, former soldiers. The world saw the Martelli family not as kings, but as criminals. In 1997, Marco was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. His empire was dismantled piece by piece. Properties seized, accounts frozen, allies imprisoned. The Silent King's dynasty was over. Epilogue: the ghost of the Martellis. Vittorio lived quietly, far from Naples, running his hotels and restaurants, forever haunted by the blood that had built his fortune. Isabella married and disappeared into anonymity, never speaking of her family again. Marco remained in prison, a relic of another age. Some say he still rules a shadowy network from behind bars, his voice carried through whispers. Others believe he was broken, his fire extinguished by solitude. Naples moved on. New clans rose, new wars ignited, but the name Martelli lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. And in the end, the lesson was clear. Power built on blood cannot endure. The streets remember every drop spilled, and the silence of the king is louder than the roar of his son.